Hi, BookTube, and welcome to another vlog covering a sizable work of nonfiction. I've had one of those strange experiences on YouTube. If you're a creator, you probably know about this. It's when the algorithm, that mythical algorithm, decides to extend its fateful hand in your direction. And the result was that suddenly and inexplicably, my last nonfiction video, well, the views just went crazy, crazy in a good way. Normally, I get maybe between 30 to 50 views of a video in its first 72 hours. This time I got over 600 and a handful of new subscribers. And so if any of you are watching, hi, brilliant, welcome, thanks, and all that. But what I should also let you know is when I tackle longer works of nonfiction, rather than do a review, because it's difficult to encapsulate a book once it gets over 450 pages, what I prefer to do is just a kind of a walk through, and that allows you to see in detail the structure of the book, with some of the rough topics it covers, and also some of the features that it has. And this video will be the first of 3 because there is a lot of material. But hopefully what this helps you to do is either gives you a shorthand knowledge of the book or helps you decide whether this is a book that you want to buy, because of course we all like to make informed spending decisions. The book we're going to look at in this vlog, Tolstoy, A Russian Life by Rosamund Bartlett, published in 2010 by Profile Books Limited. Let's give you a little information about the author, and everything that I have put down here, all the facts come from the author's website, and there'll be a link to that in my description box. Rosamund Bartlett studied Russian at Durham University, and then she went on to get her doctorate from Oxford, where she continues to hold an academic fellowship. She is the author of 3 works of nonfiction: Wagner and Russia, Chekhov, Scenes from a Life, and this biography of Tolstoy, which was longlisted in 2011 for the Samuel Johnson Prize for Nonfiction. She's also recognized for her translation work, and she produced the first new translation in 96 years of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina for the Oxford World Classics. We'll talk a little about the structure of the book. This is a good photograph for talking about structure. This structure here is Tolstoy's home at Yasnaya Polyana. Now, the text portion of the book, and I read the hardcover, was 454 pages. There are paratextual resources at the front of the book, and they include a map of the Western Russian Empire, not a very detailed map, okay? And that's set during the reign of Nicholas I. Then there is a Tolstoy chronology. There is a Tolstoy family tree, and also a family tree for his wife's family, for Sonia. There are numbered notes that appear at the back of the book, all right? There are no footnotes throughout the text. This matters to some people. And at the back of the book, what you will get is a recommended reading list in English. And I think Bartlett does this because her bibliography, which follows, contains mostly works written in Russian, as you might imagine. And then there is a list of illustrations, and there's a subject index. There are 22 glossy plate illustrations in the center of the book, and then throughout the text there are another 15 captioned illustrations. So why am I choosing to read a biography of Leo Tolstoy? This biography is just one of a selection of books that I wanted to read in order to get some context before I reread Tolstoy's War and Peace. Now, if you're new to my channel, I got to tell you this little anecdote about me. I read War and Peace for the first time because I was dared to when I was 14 years old, and I was a precocious kid. So yeah, I read it, but I don't really count it. I don't count it because I hardly understood what it was that I was reading. Over the last year, I worked out a little program of preparatory reading. I've read a cultural history of Russia that focused on the 19th and early 20th centuries. I've read a biography of Catherine the Great and an account of Napoleon's march on Moscow in 1812. The biography of Tolstoy, that's kind of the last piece of that required reading. And I think after that, I'm going to feel ready to give War and Peace the attention that it deserves. How did I get this book and how much did it cost? Well, Cambridgeshire libraries carried a hardback copy of this book at their Huntingdon branch. And if anybody is living in that area and you're now interested, I'll be returning this book in about 3 weeks' time. Okay. And I'm really grateful for that because I didn't really want to have to buy a biography. As much as I wanted to read Tolstoy's life story, I didn't really want it taking up shelf space. Shelf space is scarce in our home. You can see the books piling up behind me, and that's in spite all the books that I've read and unhauled during this last year as part of my Read What You Own challenge. For those who have more space or those who've gone past caring, the Amazon hardcover edition starts at £25, or in the US you can buy it for $22.16, and the paperback is available in the UK for £13 or $15.39 US. The US Kindle version, now that's available free of charge if you've got a Kindle Unlimited subscription. Secondhand copies, they're everywhere online, loads of them, and it shouldn't set anybody back more than, say, £10, and that includes delivery, unless you're looking for something special. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this blog is just give you some very short summaries of each of the first 6 chapters. And we'll start with the introduction. The introduction, it's 10 pages long, and it just touches lightly on some selected facts and anecdotes, and they're all meant to support Tolstoy's reputation for being a bit eccentric, larger than life, and yeah, certainly problematic. There's a sentence in the last paragraph of that introduction, and you can read it in 2 completely different ways. Let me read it. In the early years of his marriage, while he was writing War and Peace, Tolstoy would insist that his young wife was present, and so Sonia would usually curl up by his feet on the bearskin rug next to his desk, a trophy from one of his hunting expeditions. I wasn't 100% sure at first if the trophy referred to the rug or to his wife, and having finished the first 150 pages now of this biography, during which he meets and marries Sonia, I'm still not sure, okay? You'll see what I mean as we go on. Chapter 1. This chapter gave me an outline of what Bartlett calls Tolstoy's cult of his ancestors, but he had some illustrious ancestors, so it's somewhat forgivable. Bartlett goes back to the first Count Tolstoy, who was born in 1645, and then you will get short biographies of every member of Leo Tolstoy's male line. All of them are a bit larger than life themselves, with the exception of Tolstoy's poor father, Nikolai, who had to swallow his aristocratic pride and take a job in the civil service in order to pay off the debts that were left by his late father. But more illustrious than the Tolstoys were Leo's mother's line, the Volkonskys. Tolstoy's mother could trace her lineage back to the 14th century, and perhaps his most illustrious maternal relative was a hero in the war against Napoleon and the exiled leader of the Decembrist uprising, Sergei Volkonsky. And chapter 1 was where I right away could see the benefits of all this contextual reading that I had done. For example, when Bartlett talks about the son of the Empress Catherine the Great, and she says, quote, "It was Paul I's notoriously difficult temperament and constant fault-finding which ultimately prompted Volkonsky to resign permanently from the army in 1799. Well, you see, I can recall that Paul I, he grew up knowing that his mother arranged for his father's murder and assumed his throne, and that throughout his life he was never trusted by his mother with even the tiniest amount of royal responsibility while she was alive. It was a recipe for turning out a bad ruler, in my opinion. Chapter 2 is about the first 7 years of Tolstoy's childhood, growing up in a large landowning family on the Volkonsky estate of Yasnaya Polyana. And this is a photograph of the grounds. The earlier photograph of the house is now a Tolstoy museum. Tolstoy himself described his early years as an innocent, joyful, poetic period. He did not remember his mother. She died when he was only 2 years old, but there was no shortage of female relatives to look after the children. Tolstoy's maternal grandmother and 2 of his aunts also lived in that same house. Bartlett talks about the family rituals and traditions. A lot of those involve the serfs who worked either as servants in the house or on the land. And on balance, it does seem to be a very idyllic and privileged childhood, certainly far above the average Russian childhood in the early 19th century. And in chapter 2, there's also hints of natural restlessness and impulsiveness in little Leo's personality, and those traits become more established as the book progresses. Before we talk about chapter 3, I should say that there are no known images of Leo Tolstoy himself as a child. The photograph you're looking at here are his children. But when Leo Tolstoy was 9 years old, his life changed completely. His father moved the family to Moscow, and that was for the sake of the education of his older sons. Unfortunately, not many months after that move, the Tolstoy patriarch Nikolai suffered a lung hemorrhage and a stroke, and he died the same day. A year later, Tolstoy's grandmother died, and so for economic reasons, the remaining family split up, with Leo returning to Yasnaya Polyana. Now, Tolstoy, like most noble children of his age at the time, he didn't go to school, but he had tutors who lived in the house with him. His personality, I understand, made him a very difficult student, but he seemed to have had a natural intelligence, and his love of reading certainly compensated. And Bartlett ends chapter 3 by talking about some of Tolstoy's favorite books. Chapter 4 sadly sees more family loss. When Tolstoy was just 13 years old, one of his two aunts died, and that just left one woman, his father's sister, to look after all 5 Tolstoy children. I mean, it was too much. And so she had to seek out another relative who were in a suitable position to act as guardian. And unfortunately, the closest family who could help were living in Kazan, which was 350 miles east of Moscow on the other side of the Volga River. This is a modern picture of the city. Bartlett spends a few pages just describing the characteristics of the city because it was further east. There was more of a Mongol influence on its architecture and its culture. But she also spends time describing the character of the family who became responsible for Leo and his brothers, or rather who didn't. The truth is the Tolstoy boys in their adolescence pretty much were left to their own devices, and Leo Tolstoy regretted that he didn't have strong guidance during that time. With a personality that was already prone to restlessness and impulsive behavior, Leo got up to all kinds of things, and he didn't respond well to the demands of university when he reached the age to study. What interested me was that Tolstoy knew that his behavior was out of hand, and he repeatedly tried and failed to get himself into line. His earliest journals show him trying to set rules for himself and goals, things he was going to achieve, but time and time again he just kept slipping back into bad habits. Chapter 5 talks about the Tolstoy children coming of age, at which point they each received a share of the family estate. Leo was given his childhood home, Yasnaya Polyana, some of the neighboring villages, and 300 serfs. So chapter 5, you're going to find it both interesting and frustrating if you do choose to read this book. Leo is 19. This is a picture of him taken at the time, which he does look a little full of himself. But he was ready by law to become his own master. He was given great wealth, which he could increase. He had the leisure to study or do almost anything he wanted. And see, the frustrating thing is he wastes time and he squanders money. What Tolstoy most needed at this time of his life was counseling to help him, particularly with a gambling addiction. I did wonder whether he may have suffered from bipolar disorder. It just seemed that he had two different modes of being, one that was highly driven and disciplined, and then there was this other sort of dissolute way of being. And when he was in those moments of his life, that's when he was really prone to gamble away crazy amounts of money. On the positive side, Tolstoy was reading. Bartlett talks about how strongly he was affected by Rousseau and his Confessions, and Tolstoy himself began in the early 1850s to write a book about his own childhood. But the gambling remained a problem, and the only thing that seemed to change him, at least for a reasonable amount of time, was joining his older brother and becoming a commissioned officer in the Russian army. Famously, Tolstoy fought in the Crimea, and that's where he wrote articles which established his name in the literary circles of St. Petersburg. And I'm going to read you an extract from the book on page 114. So I have, and we will read from page 114. On 25th April, Tolstoy finished Sebastopol in December, his first very patriotic and gripping piece of reportage about the realities of fighting in the besieged city, and he sent it straight away to Petersburg. Together with the two other works he wrote, which make up the Sebastopol sketches, it constitutes his most sophisticated writing yet. In this first sketch, the narrator takes the reader on a tour of Sebastopol set in the present tense. So the experience of hostilities is all the more vivid when it begins, and it reminiscent of the experience of watching a film. The whistle, close at hand, of a shell or a cannonball, just at the very moment you start to climb the hill, gives you a nasty sensation. Suddenly you realize in an entirely new way the true significance of those sounds of gunfire you heard from the town. Some quiet, happy memory suddenly flickers to life in your brain. You start thinking more about yourself and less about what you observe around you, and are suddenly gripped by an unpleasant sense of indecision. Tolstoy, hailed as the first war correspondent, was adept at combining personal impressions conveyed in a conversational, intimate tone with the lofty viewpoint of a historian or epic poet able to speak for the nation. Chapter 6. Now, Chapter 6 made me smile. Because if you were a Russian writer in the 1850s, 1860s, the place to be was St. Petersburg. That was where you met other writers, and there was a lot of mutual back-scratching. Tolstoy went to St. Petersburg after the Crimean War, but it was not the right place for him to be. There was too much temptation to gamble, for a start. But more importantly, many of the writers and journal editors, they wanted art to make a particular moral or political point. Tolstoy was not into that. Tolstoy got into a lot of arguments as well, and particularly if a work that his contemporaries were all applauding seemed to him to be of inferior quality. He couldn't pretend to like something that he didn't. So in the end, he returned to Yasnaya Polyana. 5 years after he'd left it, he found himself a wife and he settled down. Now that's leaving out quite a bit. Tolstoy traveled outside Russia only once, but he went quite extensively around Europe. He traveled to Berlin, to Paris, to the south of France, to Nice, Florence, Naples, Rome, and for 11 days he was in London, and he attended a reading given by Charles Dickens at St. James Hall, Piccadilly. So the two great writers were in the same room together for a short period of time, but of course Dickens wouldn't have been aware, and Tolstoy didn't yet know that he was going to be a great writer. He then returned to Russia by way of Antwerp, Frankfurt, Dresden, and Weimar. All this travel was done under the auspices of research for the Russian Education Ministry. But even though Tolstoy was very interested in education, I'm going to save that subject for one of the two later vlogs. Okay, I hope this first vlog has given you a taste of what this book has to offer. I'll be back in about a week or so with a second vlog. That's going to take us through chapters 7 to 10. Very important ones, because they're the chapters that are going to cover the writing of War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Okay, well, I hope everyone is enjoying what they're reading right now. And a very grateful wave hello to my new subscribers if you're watching right now. And I hope to see everybody again in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.